I don't have a PowerPoint presentation this time, so I won't show you any more chess positions. I had thought if I were going to do so that this one would be a very, very ugly stalemate position. And the reason for the title of my talk, been there, haven't done that, is that years ago I was involved in a project that never went anywhere to look at getting rid of the Indian Act. And the premise was everybody hates the Indian Act. Everybody hates it. But we can't get rid of it because we disagree so strongly about what to replace it with. And we thought maybe the thing to do is not to try and get a bunch of people together to agree on that, but just to get everybody to say what they think ought to be done. And because the purpose of the conference requires us to think, again, from first principles, I won't say I'll be brief, because I've been to all kinds of conferences and nobody who says that ever is, and I probably won't be, but there are two things that guide my thinking about Aboriginal affairs. If you were to start from scratch, which is obviously you wouldn't try to get where we are now. But the first one, and I think there can really be no compromise on this, is that all people are created equal. And that the ending that we're looking for is no legal distinctions based on race. None whatsoever. The second one is that the Aboriginal people of Canada, considered not as collectivities but as individuals, do have both legitimate grievances and a strong claim for compensation, not because one race did bad things to another race, but because their individual ancestors were in many respects dispossessed of what they rightfully owned. They were cheated, it was stolen from them, treaties were signed that were not observed, all kinds of things happened. And I've sometimes, in talking to my students when I teach American history, the first contact between Europe and North America since the end of the glaciation is when the Vikings came to Vinland during the medieval warm period. Will Ferguson once referred to this. He said, it's not so much a discovery as a family reunion. And he said, like a lot of family reunions, it didn't go very well. There was an exchange of arrow fire. But what really, to me, is the great tragedy is that the medieval warm period then ended. Yes, it did. We got the Little Ice Age. And contact between Europe and the Americas, instead of being gradual, was delayed for several centuries and then was very sudden. And when it happened, Europeans, with thousands of years of settled agriculture and urban living and diseases behind them, met people with no resistance to those diseases. And in the space of perhaps 100 years, the worst demographic catastrophe in human history, something like 90% of all the inhabitants of the Americas died. And most of them died without ever seeing a white person, because these diseases just tore through their communities. And if you could go back in time and push a button that would prevent that from happening, I think anybody would push the button, but you can't. It did happen. Everything that happened has happened, and we are now where we are. But as Ken said, the picture's a lot more optimistic than that might sound. And so when we think about what is the way forward for Alberta and for Canada, I think it is very important to recognize, yes, Aboriginals are our neighbors, they are our relatives, they are our fellow Canadians, and they are individuals who may be entitled to compensation in order that we can build a better future based on the end of invidious distinctions based on race. I mean, the Indian Act denies Indians the right to own property on reserve. And as I have been saying for decades, if somebody came up and said we should deny black people the right to own property, or we should deny Orientals the right to own property, there would be such an outcry that your career would never recover. But if you say we should give Indians the right to own property, people look at you like you're strange. Not if they're Indians, of course. They're like, yeah, okay, that would be great. But they're afraid to get rid of the Indian Act, except by the gradual process Ken talked about, because they don't know what would come next. It would destroy the existing structure. It's not clear how to replace it. And for some reason, they're not entirely willing to trust the Canadian government. It's like, and I've got to tell you, of all these politicians going, Miigwech this and Miigwech that, and we're on unceded land, and every time I hear that, I think of those old Hollywood movies where after some singular piece of white man perfidy, some wise old elder declares bitterly, white men speak with forked tongue. Because all those politicians like Kathleen Wynne in Ontario have no intention of giving that land back. it's absolute nonsense. They don't mean it. When they say it's unceded land, they don't mean therefore it's yours and you can have it back. They mean nothing that anyone can decipher. But that doesn't have to be our problem, because there is ample room to compensate Aboriginals as individuals for past wrongs in a way that means we go forward together. And it doesn't mean they have to give up their culture. You know, it's the old thing about culture. If they've got cultural habits that are good, we should adopt them. You know, if they cook better than we do, or have more respect for the environment, or, you know, are just like way tougher when it comes to being outdoors, then we learn from them and it's great. We all get better. There's no need for there to be a problem between us and our Aboriginal neighbors and friends and relatives, I think, provided we admit two things. One is we are all human beings, and two is some of us, their ancestors really got treated shabbily, and yes, you're owed compensation. We can't undo history. There are wrongs that can never be righted. I have ancestors way back who got beaten up by the English, and you know what? It's too late. It's just too late. Nothing can be done. Too bad. But in Canada, there are things that can be done, like giving them reserve land, making land settlements that give them private property. Get the land into private hands. That's a good thing for everybody. So I think there's a very positive way forward, and Alberta, if it is going to become independent, yes, it needs the consent of First Nations, because among other things, the federal government will use them as leverage, say, oh no, you'll be mean to the Aboriginals. There's something like 1 in 16 people in the province identifies as Aboriginal, obviously depending where you are, including some urban areas it's higher, other areas it's lower. But there is ample opportunity for partnership here, and if Canada is not to be broken up, we still want to apply the same principles. Nobody today would suggest creating the situation that we have. Nobody would suggest it. So let us fix the thing with a generosity of spirit and a dedication to principle that if people have been cheated by the government, they ought to be compensated, and that all humans are created equal. Thank you.